And on this week's In Focus session, we're going to be talking about getting back to basics and what that means. And the reason why I want to kind of discuss that this week with you guys is because this is something that I'm really going through in my own life personally right now, which I'll kind of go on to explain a bit more about that later on in this episode. But what I really wanted to touch on first was the idea of what does it mean to get back to basics, right? Because we hear this kind of all the time, like, let's just go back to basics, let's just do the basic things. And to me, it's a really clear message on like going back to the basic needs, the basic wants, the basic desires that you have as a person or as a group or whatever it may be, right? And one of the areas that this term's always floated around in my life is sports. Like when I played a lot of football, like we'd always, if the team wasn't doing well or if we were doing well and we kind of wanted to, control the game a bit more, we'd be like, lads, let's just go back to basics. Like, let's just do the basic things well. Like, do the things that we know are good for us as a team that are going to help us, go on to try and win this game, would be the message, right? When you hear, go back to basics, go back to basics. So reflecting on that, it's like, well, what does that look like for life? Like, what does it mean to go back to basics in life? And one of the things that I was exploring this week with a coach of mine was the idea of, what does me personally, what is going back to basics? And the reason that we had this conversation was because I was talking to him about, going through the motions a little bit when it comes to work and creating, content and the podcast and stuff. I feel like sometimes you can just be going through the motions when you're doing too much of the doing. Like, you can just feel like you're going through the motions of it. And he was like, well, what does like going back to basics mean for you? Like, if you were to go back to basics and the reason of why you started the podcast and the reason why you started creating the content you create, the reason why you started coaching, like what's going back to the basics? And, reflecting on it and having that conversation with him, it was like, what was desire to want to share, people's stories. And, when it came to the podcast, like sharing people's stories, hearing the voices of people where you wouldn't necessarily hear their voice on other podcasts. I felt at the time that I'd started the first, or the UK's first inspirational podcast back in the days when it was called Dreamer's Disease, for all my day one listeners out there. And it's about, me, the conversation we had was about me trying to reconnect to that and what that means. And it's a really interesting take on things, right? Because when you take this thing of like going back to basics, it's looking at your life and going, okay, well, what is going on for me right now? What, potentially feels overwhelming, or what feels stressful, or what areas do I feel like I'm being stretched or haven't got enough time or energy or focus right now on certain things? Like, what does going back to basics mean for me? And in my own life, like I kind of feel like I have this cycle every maybe 3-4 months where I'll be super focused for like 3 months. And then the 4th month, I'll be like, oh God, I'm just feeling so down on motivation, so down on focus, so down on energy. And then I'll strip back everything I'm doing and literally go back to basics. I go, okay, what are the basics of what I'm trying to do here? And for me, the basics are always like, well, coaching and creating the podcast, because they're my two like real avenues of things that I love to do. So then everything else outside of that, I kind of clear out my diary, clear away like anything that I might be doing as a distraction and watching certain types of YouTube videos, or like if they're not directly feeding one of the two things, then that's not a basic for me in terms of what I want to create. And you can go one step further. You can go, okay, well, what are the basics for me in my life? The basics for me personally, they might be different for you, are to, spend time outdoors. The basics for me are to spend time doing things that I enjoy, which don't necessarily have an attached outcome. So for me, it's like skateboarding. My basics are, keeping myself physically fit. So taking care of what I eat, taking care of my body through stretching or workouts or whatever it may be. Like, what are the basics for you? And I really want you to kind of take a moment to explore in your own mind, like, what do those basics look like for you? Because when you really do look into it and you really do understand, like, going back to the basics in your life is something that is so fundamental to you in terms of your own growth that it's probably not talked about enough, if I'm honest. And I feel like we're in a culture and a society where it's like we're driving all the time. We're driving forward all the time to do more, create more, earn more, live more, be more. And sometimes it's like, actually, like, you can burn out doing that. And, you know, I've definitely experienced burnout over the years, like in many different ways, like mentally, physically. Right now, if I'm totally honest, I feel like creatively I'm feeling burnt out. I'm really struggling with, you know, putting content together. I'm really struggling with, you know, even just the podcast in general, to like find guests, book guests, research guests, edit the content. Like, there's so much that goes on behind the scenes of these episodes that you guys don't see. And, you know, on the front of it probably seems like, okay, cool, Alex is doing this really cool podcast and it's like, you know, doing really well for itself, and there's like, you know, the content looks great or sounds great, and whatever it is, you know, I get so much feedback on it. And, you know, don't get me wrong, I always really appreciate it, but there's always, at the same time, there's so much work that goes into that. And for me right now, I feel like I'm at a stage where, wow, I've been doing this for coming up to 4 years, which is mind blowing. Like, I can't believe it's actually been 4 years of the podcast, which is totally insane to me. And it's like amazing to know that, you know, you guys are on this journey with me. And right now I feel like I'm at the stage where it's like, the podcast, I will always be something that I do. Like, I'm 100% sure of that. I've always said it from day one when I started it. And it's funny because I remember having a conversation with someone at work at the time, and they were like, why are you starting a podcast? And I was like, because I'm not starting a podcast to try and like blow up overnight. Like, a lot of these podcasts that were starting to pop up at a similar time around when I started mine, I was like, let's see how many of them are around in 4 years' time. Most of them aren't, by the way. Whereas, you know, I'm still here, and it's like, it's something that is a deep desire in me to keep creating, to keep hearing people's stories, to keep inspiring the people who listen to the podcast. But I feel like I've got to a point at the minute where it's like, actually, I've disconnected from what the basic was when it came to the reason why I started the podcast. And I don't mean that in the sense of like I've lost my why or anything like that. What I mean is, I feel like I'm going into creating around the podcast with a different mindset to when I started it. When I started it was new, it was fresh, it was exciting. I was like really out there trying to make things happen. Whereas now I probably take a little bit more of those things for granted, and I kind of focus more on the doing and trying to grow the podcast and trying to make it the best it can be, instead of just being really excited by it. And part of the reason why I wanted to have this discussion about getting back to basics is because, you know, after having this conversation with my coaches, I've decided really that I'm going to take a bit of a break from the podcast for, I don't know how long it's going to be yet, but it could be a few weeks, it could be a couple months, I don't know. Just so I can have that time to get back to the basics for me. And, you know, I wouldn't be doing the things I do and sharing what I do and having the type of conversations that I have on this podcast. I can't do this if I'm not being connected to myself. Like, that's a real deep basic for me, for this podcast. And I feel like where I feel like I'm a little bit more disconnected from that right now, I want to take some time just to reconnect to that. Because I think that's where the power happens. And it's like, you can get so caught up in the doing. You can get so caught up in, you know, the consistency. And it's like, for me, in 4 years, I think I've only ever missed 2 weekly releases in 4 years, which is insane. Like, that's unreal consistency, right? But at the same time, it's like, then it gets to a point where you become so focused on the consistency that you're like, well, I can't stop now because of all this momentum and all of this consistency that I've built up. And it's like, then you lose that element of, like I said, of the basics of the connection you've had to why you started the thing, right? And again, this doesn't necessarily have to relate to my podcast. This can relate to how you want to show up with your relationships. This can be how you show up for your exercise plan, your nutrition, your work projects. Like, it could be anything, like your hobbies, right? It's about fundamentally reconnecting yourself to the basics of why you started that thing and the basic needs and desires and wants that you had for that thing, right? And what I'm saying is, for me right now, it's like that space is going to allow me to really like just sit in the stillness, to sit in the, you know, metaphoric quiet, and really be with myself again, and just really come out of that fresh, replenished, ready to go and start almost like a part 2, no, probably be a part 3 version of the podcast, because it was like the original part was like when it launched, Dreamer's Disease, then rebranding it last year to In the Moment. And then this next stage will be like the third stage, right? And it's, to me, it's really exciting to be able to do that and take that time. And I wanted to kind of, share that with you guys, because I feel like it's so easy to get caught up in the stuff that we do in life. It's so easy to get caught up in the doings of life, and we can get disconnected from who we are and the way that we want to be in life, because we're so focused on the doing. And like, you guys would have heard me talk about, the difference between being and doing many, many times. And I feel like I wouldn't be me if I wasn't allowing myself to reconnect to my being and I was solely focused on my doing. And part of my work as a coach and what I do on the podcast is to like lead by example. Like, I'm trying to live my life in a certain type of way. I'm trying to understand certain types of things, and then I'm sharing those learnings with you guys, and I'm hearing other people share their journeys and their stories on the podcast. And like I said, I wouldn't be me. I wouldn't be a coach if I wasn't able to lead and live by example. And that's kind of what I'm doing here, is I want to show you guys that I'm always doing this work for myself. I'm always understanding this work for myself. I'm not here trying to preach, trying to tell you this is the way you have to live your life. I'm just trying to share what I'm learning along the way, and hopefully something connects with you somewhere. So I'd really love to kind of hear from you off of the back of this episode, like, and hear what you're going to take from this episode. Like, what are the basics for you in your life? What does that going back to basics look like for you? Or even like, what are the areas in your life where you feel like you need to get back to basics? Because I think being able to recognize those and then address those and accept those is really going to help, facilitate growth in your own life. And that's I know true for me, and that's what I'm, hoping to experience in this next, few weeks or however long it will be away from the podcast. Just give me that space to really reconnect to myself. So like I said, I'd love to hear from you, to hear what areas of your life you feel like you want to get back to basics on, or even if you already know like what your basics are, then just hit me up on Instagram at @IamAlexManzi, drop me a DM, let me know what you've taken from this episode and what those basics look like for you. And also, if you know anyone who you think would really benefit from hearing this episode, then be sure to share them the link, the screenshot of it, whatever it is. Send it to them today, because it's really important that we continue to spread the positive vibes and messages of episodes like this. I started this podcast because I wanted to inspire a positive change in people, and you can really be a part of that by sharing this episode with someone that you know today with a personal message on why you think they should listen to it. So I want to thank you for listening. I will see you soon, sometime, for the next episode. Be sure to come and hit me up on Instagram. I'll still be hanging out there, and I look forward to hearing from you guys and seeing you soon.